Disney is easily the most recognizable and powerful media corporation in the whole world. When it comes to the production of animated films and shows, there's no other company on Earth that even comes close. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, in the 1940s, Disney was very close to shutting its doors forever. But a well-timed deal with a government contractor saved the company from destruction and brought us one of Disney's most thought-provoking and important films ever made. Today we'll take a look at how Education for Death came to be, why it's so crucial, and how it manages to be one of Disney's most profound works of art. So let's wind the clock back to 1940. Disney was in some serious hot water, to say the very least. Walt Disney, a man who never strayed from an opportunity to show the world how quirky he was, ended up spending 4 times the originally intended budget on Fantasia, that year's big-budget release. Of the film, he said, "Fantasia, to me, is a whole new opportunity. For my medium, it opens up unlimited possibilities." Well, it didn't do that, but what it did do was deeply embarrass the company when it turned out to be a financial and critical failure. This would have been bad enough on its own, but Disney was facing a lot of other troubles at the time that threatened to destroy the company. Half of their entire workforce was striking for better working conditions, and financial mismanagement and overspending had made it so Disney was basically a hair away from filing bankruptcy. It was only then that a minor miracle came for Disney in the form of Lockheed, better known today as Lockheed Martin. You see, Walt Disney was a real America-loving patriot, and as such, he formed a close bond with the military contractor. So close was their relationship that Disney designed over 1,200 military insignias for jackets and planes, beginning in the early 1930s and lasting throughout World War II. Disney also allowed the U.S. Army to use the studio as a place for soldiers to rest. Using this very close relationship to his advantage, Walt Disney managed to convince Lockheed to obtain a government contract for Disney. This contract consisted of a commission from the U.S. government for 32 propaganda films, which Disney was paid $4,500 each, totaling $144,000. A fun fact, by the way, adjusted for inflation, that's about $2.9 million in 2021 money, and that number is only 14% of what Disney now makes in a single day. With this money, Disney was able to keep its employees on payroll and prevented them from having to close their doors. The most famous and noteworthy of these films produced was Education for Death, released in 1943, 2 years before the end of World War II. The film was based on the novel The Making of a Nazi by Gregor Ziemer, a German-American author who fled Germany shortly before the beginning of the war. Now this is, in my mind, unchallenged as Disney's most important, meaningful, and actually controversial film ever made, and I mean that. Never before or since has any animation company, to my knowledge, been willing to explore the message and themes that this film does. I also have to say that while there are some things in this film that aren't perfectly accurate, nothing in the film is without some level of truth to it, and I'll point that out as we go along. Now, I don't even want to give you any details of the plot before we explore this film, because I think it works better if you don't know what it's about beforehand. After we go through the plot, I have a lot to say about this film, and with that said, let us begin. Within the first few seconds, we already get the first of many wonderful subtleties in this film. The music is both triumphant but also threatening, which is a fantastic herald of what's to come throughout.
What makes a Nazi? How does he get that way? Well, let's look into the process. To begin with, Nazi control over a German child starts as soon as it's born.
We're introduced to a German couple who comes to the courthouse to register the birth of their newborn son. When they arrive, they have to present birth certificates proving they're Aryan to the judge. Now, whereas I couldn't find any proof of this exact practice in Germany at the time, I do know that there was a policy known as Lebensborn, which means the fountain of life in German, that was in practice at the time, which involved the state promoting high birth rates among white ethnic Germans in an effort to create more soldiers. They touch on this a moment later as the judge gives them a new passport with room for several more children's names. They also mention the Verboten list, a list of forbidden names, which is also accurate, although it was slightly different from the way it's presented here. Rather than a list of outright banned names, there was a list of names that only white Germans were allowed to use, and then a list of names that everybody else could use. We then transition to a scene of Hans, the baby, being told a fairy tale. In the story, Sleeping Beauty is meant to represent Germany, and Adolf Hitler is presented as a knight. The villain of the story, a witch, is meant to represent democracy. Now, once again, this isn't an exact replica of what would have been going on, but it's most definitely not a lie. Fairy tales were absolutely used as a tool of indoctrination, and I have a couple of examples. One being how children were told that Cinderella's beauty came from the fact that she was a white woman, which distinguished her from her quote-unquote mongrel stepsisters. That's the word they used. And also, Red Riding Hood was supposed to represent the people of Germany, while the wolf represented the supposedly predatory Jewish population. I think this is a good time to mention something else about this film I find particularly fascinating, which is the fact that all of the characters speak German with no translation and no subtitles, meaning the audience isn't allowed to hear their actual words. The only English voice we get throughout is that of our booming protagonist who narrates the story, and in that sense he kind of steals the voice away from the cast.
Hier sind unsere Geburtsscheine, die Geburtsscheine unserer Eltern.
Those documents are birth certificates, all the way back to their great-grandparents, proving, of course, that they are pure Aryan.
It's another one of the brilliant subtleties throughout the film. This fairy tale scene is the only bit of comedy throughout, and although I think it goes on for a little too long, it's most definitely a necessary part of it. We then transition to Hans as a young boy, where he's very sick and bedridden. His mother's comforting him and trying to nurse him back to health when a Nazi officer bursts into the room and warns her that if he doesn't get better, he'll be taken away by the state. Now once again, this probably seems absurd on the face of it, but it's actually not. This scene is meant to reference the Aktien T4, meaning action. This was a protocol ordered by Hitler himself, who decreed that anyone suffering from a physical or mental disability, or anyone who was incurably sick, would be executed. Or as he referred to it, mercy killed. The majority of the victims were simply pulled out of their hospital beds and shot. This resulted in the deaths of about 300,000 people, and although most of them were adults or the elderly, about 5,000 children and infants were also murdered during this time, so this scene, as much as I thought it was an exaggeration, is absolutely true. The next scene is of Hans in school, where his teacher gives a lecture about social Darwinism. In it, he shows a rabbit that gets eaten by a wolf. When the teacher asks Hans what he thinks the lesson is supposed to be, we get this.
Das arme Häschen.
He said the poor rabbit. Is he out of his mind?
The narrator then insults Hans for his compassion toward the rabbit, and after the class does the same, Hans launches into a rant about how the weak deserve to die.
Ich hasse es!
He hates the rabbit. There's no room for weaklings. Hans is learning fast. My, how he hates that rabbit.
Ich hasse ihn!
This is definitely among the more disturbing scenes from the cartoon, and the idea that the Nazis encouraged hatred and cruelty toward those they perceived as weak is so accurate that I don't think it even needs confirming. And finally, we get to the last segment of the film, wherein Hans is drafted into the military for his higher education, as they put it. I don't know if this is a fun fact per se, but it is a fact nonetheless that this voice... That's actually Hitler. It's a voice clip from one of his speeches. I just thought you might want to know. We see the soldiers destroy a village and replace Christian symbols with symbols of the state. Now, this is probably the biggest stretch in the film, but even still, it's not without some level of truth. You see, Hitler basically did every single thing that Benito Mussolini did to build his empire. He was a copycat of the highest order. And so, when Mussolini declared Catholicism as the new state religion, Hitler did the same. Soon after, however, Hitler reversed this decision because he feared that splitting power with the church would threaten his absolute control over Germany. The Nazi Party probably didn't do anything to this extent. I don't know. I couldn't find any evidence of something similar to this, because it would have been extremely controversial considering the vast majority of Germans were Christians. But he did intend to replace the church with a new religion that was a form of ethnotheism, or the worship of a particular race. And so, once again, this isn't a lie. Then we get the single best piece of animation in this entire film. Not only because of the brilliant symbolism, which I personally think is probably the best out of the entire film, but we also get this absolutely stunningly fluid and clean-cut animation.
Manhood finds him still, hiling and marching. But the grim years of regimentation have done their work. Now he's a good Nazi. He sees no more than the party wants him to. He says nothing but what the party wants him to say. And he does nothing but what the party wants him to do.
We're left on this image of a field of gravestones where we get our closing and most powerful line.
For now, his education is complete. His education for death.
So now that we've got a synopsis of the plot, let's dissect it a little bit. The reason I say this film is the most important thing that Disney ever made is twofold. One, it shows a willingness to explore dark themes in a way that no other animation studio I can think of does. This took a lot of gumption to put on screen, and I have a lot of respect for studios that don't treat children as if they're too fragile to ever hear about real-world evils. In this vein, I also appreciate that they didn't shy away from telling the brutal and cruel truths of Nazi Germany, and didn't make it so cartoonish that it loses all grip on reality. But most importantly, and number 2 on the list of why this film is so important and unique, is that it shows us a perspective that's never allowed in the modern day. Namely, it shows us a story through the perspective of a monstrous person. Even more importantly, it shows us a fundamental truth that most of us don't want to believe. That monsters are made, they're not born. Every person in a hateful ideology was manipulated into it through social pressure, propaganda, or even the deprivation of resources. What I find so artful about this film, however, is that it doesn't try to make you sympathize with Hans. It honestly doesn't even ask you to empathize with him. All it asks of you is that you see how he became the monster he did. It's very tempting to write off hateful and bigoted people as irredeemable and wretched to the point that most of us almost subspeciate them in a sense. I know because I do it. Because even despite my ability to understand that many of these people were simply victims of a vile society, it's nearly impossible to hear racist and bigoted things from someone and look at them as anything but a lost cause. But I do want to end on a positive note, unlike the ending of this film, which is that people can and do change. I know this for a fact because I most certainly did. Now, I was never anywhere even close to Hans, so don't think I was ever like this. But I definitely believed some things even just a few years ago that I look back on and say, that's a little yikesy. But anyways, to close us off here, if you'd like to watch this film, and I highly suggest that you do, it's only about 10 minutes, you can find it on YouTube, I've linked it below. It's also on Wikipedia, and in all places it's completely free. So check it out if you got the time. Well, have I proven this channel's tone deaf yet? I go from reviewing silly, goofy things to reviewing a film about World War II. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like the video if you liked it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more videos like this. That's all for now.